This is a story that spans over 30 years. I'll try to write only what's relevant to keep it short. Edit. Well, that didn't work. Sorry for the wall of text. Background. My grandparents owned some nice land on a lakeshore about 4 hours away and decided to build a little vacation house on it. They would spend every summer there at first, sometimes bringing my two older sisters along. The eldest entitled sister and cool sister. Entitled sister went for the whole summer a few times without cool sister. I didn't go at this point in time because I was too young. It is important to note that while initial ownership of the land and some of the construction costs were paid for by my grandparents, it was really my dad who paid the rest of the bills, taxes, utilities, lawn service, etc., which he saw as fair enough since they helped him start his business, and he loved his parents. As time went on and their health was declining, they started going to the lake for much shorter spans of time. I think I went once or twice with them on these shorter trips, and would go with my parents on the rare occasions they would go up in fall, and a few times for the 4th of July. Those fall trips were almost exclusively to do maintenance, and a little fun on the side. Around this point in time, Grandpa passed away. Grandma would be around for a long time after that, though. She was always much healthier than he was. When my sisters were old enough to drive and do their own thing, an agreement was made between my dad and Grandma that my sisters could go to the lake house whenever they wanted to, on the condition that every other trip they would bring Grandma with, as she couldn't drive the trip herself. Cool sister held this bargain up for the first few times she went. I even got to join them for a couple of those trips. Entitled sister, not so much. I think entitled sister brought Grandma to the lake 2, maybe 3 times collectively, with a lot more trips with her husband in between than could possibly equate to every other time. Eventually, she just forgot the whole take Grandma with thing and started just going to the lake all the time. Her forgetting Grandma got to the point that when she would come back after her trips to drop the keys off, that she was always too busy to come in and say hi to Grandma for a minute or 5. The rest of us saw this as majorly uncool. Grandma herself felt extremely betrayed by entitled sister because of that. It's worth noting that when entitled sister was little, she was most certainly my grandparents' favorite. They were always buying her things and taking her places and treating her like a princess. That probably explains why entitled sister turned out the way she did. At this point in time, the lake house more so belonged to my dad than anyone, even though he barely used it, partially because he didn't have the time to go, partially because he had too much physical pain to want to make a 4-hour drive. One year for Christmas, entitled sister bought new sheets and comforters for the beds at the lake house and boxed them up and gifted them to my dad. This essentially was a gift to herself though, as at this point in time, she was the almost exclusive user of the house. It was seen for what it was. Everybody chalked it up to her usual selfishness, but didn't call her on it. My dad had strongly debated selling the lake house since only entitled sister was using it anymore. For anyone who knows what just owning a house costs in America, he had good reason for wanting to take those bills off his desk. But he decided against it as my grandma was still around and felt it would break her heart if he sold it, possibly harming her then dwindling health. Entitled sister continued to use the house to her heart's content, with rare trips in between from my parents and even rarer trips from cool sister. My parents would bring Grandma to the lake the few times they went, since entitled sister couldn't be bothered to do so. At this point in time, I was able to drive, but being single and not really having any friends who were outdoorsy, I didn't really see the point in going there alone. So I didn't go other than sometimes with my parents. Maintenance fell to my parents, myself, and cool sister. That was mainly what those rare trips I was involved with revolved around. Entitlement gone wild. Not too long after Grandma passed and left everything to Dad, since he was the one keeping everything paid for and fixed. Entitled sister continued to use the lake house as she had been doing, albeit with even a little more entitlement now that she felt it belonged to her. The rest of the immediate family went and cleaned up the house so it would present nicely for sales photos. Entitled sister flipped out when she found out the house was going on the market, stating, "Oh yeah, I guess Dad is going to hawk the house and pocket the money," to my mother at one point. This sentiment quickly got back to my dad, and my dad, being kinder than I could have been, offered the house to entitled sister for free. The plan was to gift it to her a certain amount every year for 10 to 15 years so she wouldn't be taxed on the exchange of the deed, and that entitled sister's family would just take over the bills. She didn't like this because she felt he was just going to take it away from her at the last second, even though there was no plausible reason he would want to do that, especially at his age. She also didn't like the $6,000 a year in property tax, utilities, lawn care, etc., saying that they couldn't afford it, even though her family was taking something on the order of $10,000 to $20,000 worth of vacations every year in addition to the numerous lake house trips. It was also offered to become hers instantaneously, which would cost her extra money, but then she wouldn't be afraid of having it taken away. This, of course, was also rejected. So Dad put it up for sale, as he was tired of paying $6,000 a year for something he didn't use and barely anyone other than entitled sister used. Entitled sister raged about this in her 37 going on 13 way, but that still didn't stop her from going to the lake all the time. She said it would, and it did at first, but it didn't stay that way very long. The lake house sat on the market for years, with periodic price drops, as it was originally listed at an optimistic price by my dad, in hopes that he might recover some of the sunk costs from over the years. The offer of, "You can just have the lake house, just pay the bills," was floated to entitled sister at least 2 more times during this. I believe she assumed the house would never sell and Dad would eventually just give up. Enough time had passed that I found myself in a steady relationship with someone and finally felt I had a reason to go to the lake house, since it was still in the family. But it seemed that any desirable date and time I wanted to go, entitled sister had already laid claim to it. So even though I was busy all the time, similar to my dad, and had rare opportunities to go, I had to schedule around entitled sister, who was able to go to the lake pretty much anytime she felt like it. Her schedule is immensely flexible because she doesn't work. Her husband makes loads of money and pays for everything for her. Recently, though, out of nowhere, some buyers found the lake house and the whole closing process began. Closing day was to be in less than a month. My parents couldn't decide how to delicately give this news to the entitled sister, since they knew crap was going to hit the fan with her. The decision was taken out of their hands when entitled sister came to my parents' house and announced she was going to the lake house on XYZ date that was a week after the closing date. They were forced to tell her that it sold, and she started crying and sprinted back to her car. It was as though she was 5 and just discovered that Santa isn't real. Mind you, at this point, she was 42. A couple days later, her husband came over to have a talk with my dad about the lake house. Entitled sister didn't join her husband in this, just gave him a few talking points. This presumably was because she was incapable of holding back her rage during this meeting. In the conversation, the deal of, "You guys can just have the house, just take over the bills," was offered yet again, and rejected yet again for the same BS reason. Through further discussion, it turned out that entitled sister and her husband felt my dad had enough money, and that my dad was more than able to continue paying the bills on the lake house so it could stay in the family. Read, "Keep getting used for free" by entitled sister. My dad, with the apparent patience of a saint, didn't flip out over such an unreasonable expectation, just stated they were at an impasse and it was going to be sold. Entitled sister's husband then tried to bargain for entitled sister to go for one last weekend because entitled sister wants to at least say goodbye to grandma. This was totally laughable, since entitled sister couldn't be asked to take a minute out of her busy schedule to even say hi to the sweet old woman when she was alive. I don't think entitled sister even gave her a phone call in all those years. My dad didn't point out any of that, though, just stated that since the deal was so close, he didn't want to do anything that might upset the buyers. This was met with immense disappointment, as now entitled sister's husband had to go home and feel her wrath when he delivered the news. The end result. The lake house was sold to a lovely older couple at a pretty sizable loss. Entitled sister is barely speaking to my parents now. Not a big change from normal, really. Shocking, I know. Despite my parents being far more accommodating than I would have been in their position. At one point in time since the sale, she mentioned that she had spent over $300 on the bedding for the lake house that she wasn't going to get back, since the new people kept the furniture. This is, of course, forgetting the part where she gave the bedding to my dad for Christmas many years before. I really don't know what her endgame was. Did she expect my dad to keep paying the bills until he dies? If so, what then? If she were to inherit the lake house at that time, she would still have to pay the bills they just can't afford, plus the exorbitant taxes for transferring something valuable. The most likely scenario I can come up with is that she was assuming because I'm most likely to take over the reins in the coming years, that I would take over the bills and let her keep using it, tolerating her horse duckery the same way my borderline saintly parents have. Pretty amusing, considering she barely has acknowledged, that I even exist over the years. That used to really bother me, but this whole situation, among other unnecessary confrontations, has made me realize things are better off that way. I want a lake house. Duck your sister. She's a new type of entitled. About 4 years ago, my father-in-law, Phil, finally got divorced. Now, I say finally because the actual divorce began nearly 5-6 years ago. I only entered the picture 3 years ago, so this story is put together from being told about it multiple times by my in-laws and wife. Phil and my evil stepmother outlaw, Cruella, went through a long, bitter divorce. They were both at fault, but in my opinion, she was more so. The youngest of Phil's 5 children, his daughter, my sister-in-law, is the epitome of an entitled child. See my other post for more details. At the same time of this story, she was 18 and had just left for her first semester in university. Phil bought a pair of season ticket books every year for their MLB and NFL teams. He would take one of his 5 kids or a friend to games, or even give the tickets so a kid could take a friend. He's been doing this for over a decade. Over a year into the divorce, and the NFL tickets arrived. By this point, Cruella had her own apartment, and they were well and truly separated. Cruella loved pouring poison into sister-in-law's ear, and she truly is a terrible mother and an entitled human. Whenever sister-in-law did something wrong or made Phil angry, Cruella would step in and take her daughter's side. Unless it was something that made Cruella angry, then she'd demand Phil punish sister-in-law. But she would then be the one to comfort her daughter. Cruella also married Phil for the money. She was the receptionist in his firm until he made it big and then seduced him away from his first wife. The moment they got married, she stopped working, did no household chores, had a nanny to raise the kids, and always ordered food as she never cooked. While at work with his firm, sister-in-law came back to his house, not uncommon. She did this often, as university and her apartment were about 3 hours away. Well, she let herself in, went into his bedroom and into his bedside table, and sister-in-law took both ticket books. Needless to say, Phil was furious when he found out. He demanded the books that he paid for back. Sister-in-law said that her mother deserved half of everything, including the tickets. Now, many of you may point out, and I agree that if you're feeling charitable, then half the game should have gone to her, but not the entire season. Well, sister-in-law was full of righteousness and went off at Phil, going so far as to curse and say everything was his fault. So Phil gave her 2 options. 1, return the tickets and apologize. 2, return her key to the house and stay with Cruella. Sister-in-law refuses to return the tickets, so he tells her to leave. My then not wife goes over to see him, as sister-in-law cakes her just crying and saying, "Daddy threw me out." So my wife goes to get Phil's side of the story. Within an hour, Cruella calls him up and starts berating him that he's a terrible person for throwing his daughter out. Phil defends himself, that she stole from him. Here Cruella says, "The stupid tickets don't matter. It's how you're treating your daughter." Cruella demands that Phil apologize for doing that to sister-in-law, his own daughter. Now, I want to take a moment here to add that Phil, Cruella, Curly, Phil's 3rd son, Cruella's only, and sister-in-law had lived in the house for nearly a decade. And until the divorce, my wife didn't have a key because Cruella didn't want anybody but their family to have access. I'd also like to add that despite Cruella, all 5 siblings never used the term half-sibling. They love each other equally. This goes on for a bit where Phil says if sister-in-law returns the tickets, then she's welcome back in the house. Cruella responds with, "Will you forget the tickets? This isn't about them." My then not wife responds with, "If it's not about the tickets, then there shouldn't be any issue in returning them." Cruella said a few more things about Phil being a child and driving his daughter away and ruining their relationship. That really hurt him. Ultimately, the book tickets did get returned, but with 2 game tickets missing, and enough time had passed that they missed at least one game that nobody went to. Phil has not bought a season book since then, much to the disappointment of my wife, who loves going with him, as it's where they always bonded the most. Sister-in-law received no support from any of her siblings. My wife provided partial support in listening and agreeing that their father said some hurtful things, but that sister-in-law was in the wrong for stealing the tickets. She still believes that her mother was entitled to the tickets. They did figure out that Cruella pretty much put sister-in-law up to it. The evil stepmother outlaw had her own sense of entitlement. One of the reasons that the divorce lasted so long is that Cruella felt she deserved more than half the accounts, as Phil was still working while she hadn't worked in 20-plus years, essentially from the moment Curly was conceived. In my city, that would literally be thousands of dollars that the sister-in-law stole, for the duration of the time she stole it. 2 of our major sports, hockey and football, have season ticket waiting lists that are literally miles long. Someone usually has to die for someone to get season tickets to our football team. Season tickets for our baseball and soccer teams go relatively cheap though,